Today, we're going to be talking about pride. You know, the result of our egocentric self, the force that keeps saying we must be right. Well, this is what we are going to be talking about today. You see, pride is just too heavy a burden to carry. It always defending ourselves, always fighting to be right. It's just too wearisome a struggle. If we are tired about this, there is a solution. Why not lay all this baggage down at the foot of the cross? What does it mean? Well, it means stop hiding behind the pretense of truth. Accept the truth that Christ speaks, and when we accept it, it will pierce our own hearts and it will change us. So today, the story is about pride. We are going to be looking at a scene in the Bible, and we're going to be following this scene through the experience of one man. And this man is named Nicodemus. And this is how the story goes. I want you to imagine a man. This man was an intellectual who studied at the temple in Jerusalem. This man's life centered around this sacred site in the temple. He was a well-respected man, but one time he went outside this sacred site. He wanted to ask questions. However, he wanted to make sure that these questions were answered not in the daytime, but at night. And what he never dreamt of was that the answers wouldn't come until what seemed to be one of the darkest days in history. The light would finally dawn on this man as he tenderly handled a corpse right at the end. In other words, we're going to trace the change in this person from this night when he went out secretly seeking answers to questions that he may have, between that time and when he handled a corpse. And we want to see how this man changed. We wanted to see how pride was finally taken away and replaced by a better thing called the truth. Well, let's start the story. A spring wind was sweeping through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. Night had settled over the city, and most of its citizens were in their homes. They were either preparing for bed, perhaps having a bit of a supper. But one dignified, prominent priest walked in the dark with a determined look on his face. Now, his objective, his destination tonight was a certain very quiet spot just outside the city. And this was a spot where he knew a person called Jesus of Nazareth would often retire to pray. Now, this man had been going through quite a struggle to get to this point. He had worked hard. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which is the supreme Jewish court of justice. His name, Nicodemus, meant victor over the people. That's what his name meant. And he occupied a very important position in society. And everything in his aristocratic background, everything in the beliefs held by his peers told him not to make this visit tonight to this lowly man called Jesus. You know, how could this prestigious, highly qualified, and highly considered priest would want to talk to a low teacher that all the other priests, all the other peers of Nicodemus thought that this lowly teacher was nothing? It was just another person from Nazareth who claims to be a teacher. You see, this Jesus, after all, had attacked the center of the power of this priesthood, the sacred temple in Jerusalem. He had boldly driven out the merchants who provided animals for the sacrifices, as if the temple were his private domain anyway. Say, this was a time after Jesus was angry at the merchants who were turning his Father's house into a marketplace. Now, everyone around Nicodemus had come to regard Jesus as an enemy, but Nicodemus had always prided himself to being a fair-minded man, a rational man, he would say. So he did a little bit of an investigation. He listened to the people. He talked to people around in a market who were claiming that Jesus had performed miracles. Well, it was hard to deny that something remarkable was happening. The more he heard, the more he talked about, the more Nicodemus investigated. Nicodemus felt convicted that fundamentally this person, Jesus, was indeed a good man, because in his research, he's never come across or heard of anything that was bad that was done by Jesus. Everything this man Jesus had ever done was good. But this posed a terrible dilemma for Nicodemus, particularly as a Pharisee. See, as a Pharisee, he had always stood for integrity, and he always believed that he stood for integrity. He believed that he stood for the law of God. But this Jesus seems to be in a constant conflict with the Pharisees. And if he was a good man, how could this be? So you could see the dilemma in the mind of Nicodemus after his investigations. Finally, Nicodemus couldn't stand it anymore. He decided that he had to check Jesus out for himself. But he would go only at night. He told himself that if he went openly, others might follow his example. And he wasn't at all sure yet about this Galilean rabbi or this Galilean teacher. You see what's happening here? What Nicodemus couldn't admit to himself was that he feared what his peers might say. That's why he went out at night. He was concerned about his own reputation. I mean, can you imagine that? A highly sought-after priest. It's a little bit humiliating for him to be talking and chasing a lowly servant who claims to be a teacher. It was really humiliating to be seen chasing after this crowd-pleasing miracle worker, I suppose. But you see, Nicodemus decided still to go and search out this rabbi at night. And as Nicodemus came up to the olive grove where Jesus was meditating and coming face to face with Christ, Nicodemus said, "Rabbi, we know that you are the teacher from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." John chapter 3, verse 2. Now, in this verse, when Nicodemus said, "we," he was referring to the whole Pharisees, we Pharisees, that's what he meant. But in fact, this "we" mean the bunch of Pharisees didn't know any such thing. The Pharisees didn't know that this person from Nazareth, the son of, all they knew was he was a son of Beelzebub, and he was kind of a teacher, quite a popular person, but they did not know that this teacher actually came from God. So Nicodemus was in part just trying to be polite to Jesus. Also, he thought he might get Jesus to open up if he spoke of his ministry in kind of good terms and complimented him. Well, Jesus did open up in ways that Nicodemus hadn't bargained for. What did Jesus do or say? Well, without pausing, Without any little chit-chat, Jesus went for the jugular. He spoke openly and he made this famous reply, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Unquote. John 3:3. Well, that really shocked Nicodemus. He didn't know what to say. He'd apparently just been diagnosed and prescribed some drastic medicine. But what was the disease? Nicodemus himself hadn't hinted that he was even ill. Nicodemus, the priest, had to think fast if he was going to keep this interview on the level of a pleasant discussion. Nothing more. You see, Jesus at this time had went straight for Nicodemus' heart. He saw straight through to him. So Nicodemus asked in disbelief in response. In John chapter 3, verse 4, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb?" Unquote. I'm sure Nicodemus at this point was actually responding to the piercing truth that Jesus went straight for his heart. And as a proud intellectual, he responded in what a proud intellectual would do: sarcasm. You see, the tone that Nicodemus used was simply saying, "Aren't you stupid to say that sort of thing to an intellectual like me? I mean, how could someone simply enter the womb again and be reborn? Only a stupid idiot would say that." That's the inference and the tone that Nicodemus has taken up. Well, simply because of what? Of his intellectual pride. But you see, Nicodemus knew better than to take on Jesus' words literally. The Jewish priests themselves sometimes spoke of Gentile converts as children just born, and they used the same metaphor to describe a bridegroom at his marriage and a king at his enthronement. You see, Nicodemus knew that, but you see, he still responded in this spiteful manner. Why? Pride is the reason. So Nicodemus was really trying to be a little bit intellectual, and he's doing a little bit of intellectual fencing with Jesus. And of course, at this time, Nicodemus is starting to say, well, I can understand why he is our adversary. See, the Pharisees were seeing Jesus as an adversary at that time. So Jesus pressed on. In his quiet and calm and collected manner, he pressed on and he hit his point home, straight into the heart. He said he was talking about a spiritual rebirth, not something physical. He described the spirit as an invisible force that moves through human life, like the wind moving over the landscape. Now that was too much for Nicodemus. He was starting to grow quite uncomfortable now. Notice here, Jesus didn't answer the fool according to his folly. He just simply spoke the truth and spoke straight to the heart. And Nicodemus, as a result, was a little bit shaken. You see, after all, he was the very top of the Jewish society, at the very top of his religious society and the Jewish culture. He was accustomed to issuing verdicts and handing out judgments, not receiving pointed advice specifically at his heart. But you have here a lowly Galilean teacher who had not much education compared to Nicodemus, was simply and directly telling him that he had to be born again spiritually. He had to start all over again. And that was too much for this proud leader of the Jewish society. And of course, what would the response be? Well, what would you expect the response be from a proud leader of the Jewish Sanhedrin? Well, he just basically said, how can these things be? See, he's mocking Jesus here. And he's asked a skeptical question. He is pretending to be stupid, pretending he doesn't get it. He's asserting his intellectual prowess over Jesus here. Then Jesus saw this opportunity to finish the work. Jesus refused to take a detour into any debate. See, that's what Nicodemus was trying to get into. Jesus very earnestly told this Pharisee that he was showing him the way to eternal life, that God loved the world so much that he gave up his Son, that whoever believes in him is not condemned, and that human beings are judged by how they respond to this light given to them. Jesus didn't waste any time. He went straight for Nicodemus' heart. And at that time, it must have started to make an impact, because Nicodemus started to feel very uncomfortable. And by the time he made his way back home, down the slope towards Jerusalem, he would have heard quite enough. The interview hadn't gone at all like he had planned, like he had expected. He had come to check out Jesus, perhaps have an intellectual argument with him and win that argument. But Nicodemus himself had been held up to the light. Jesus showed him the light. Jesus showed him the truth. And Nicodemus' first instinct was to run from it as far as he could. You see, Nicodemus faced a question we all must face. What does it mean to be born again? What Jesus was trying to point out was the radical nature of a new birth, the inner change. The Son of God coming to a person's life, Jesus said, it's just like a wind blowing over the landscape. It may be invisible, but it affects everything in its path. So let's take a detour here. What does it mean to be born again? What does it mean to start over again as a spiritual creature? Well, if we try and describe what being born again, perhaps if you imagine this, it might help. That all of us individuals are stuck in this linear definition of time on this earth. We're stuck in time. And we don't know how to get out of it. But then suddenly you get in touch with the eternity, which is out of time. You suddenly get this feeling that you are not constricted anymore. You are now floating beyond your previous old experience that is stuck within linear time. You see, individuals mire in the problems of this world. And when they get stuck in this problem, it's like being stuck in a gutter and doesn't know that you can actually get out. But then when you get out of this dirty gutter and you stood up and you look back, you are literally like individuals mired in the problems of the world, and now you're transformed by the values and the truth that Jesus has shown us, the light that has shown us, and we're transformed by the values of heaven. That is an environment out of time and out of the problems of this world. Perhaps a more simpler example might be, in one sense, being born again is like learning a new language. Let's assume you went to a country and you don't know the language of the country. And I've been there before. For instance, I went to Brazil. I didn't speak a word of Portuguese, and I couldn't even order a can of orange juice. You went in there, and let's say you live there, and you would feel like you've been stuck in time. In that country, the culture, everything will be close to you. But suddenly, one day, if you studied the language, practiced it, and mastered it, then it's like a whole new world opening up to you. You suddenly understand more when you know that language. You suddenly are more clearer, and your life takes a turn. That's what being born again is all about. You see, the challenge of being born again is a challenge of living in a whole new world, a spiritual world where Jesus reigns. So let's go back to Nicodemus. You see, he would have to face an all-important choice. It was a choice between remaining in this linear time, this dirty gutter, or remaining a questioning skeptic, or becoming a devoted follower. See, he has to make that choice. It's a choice between remaining where he was or entering into the whole new world that Jesus has just opened up for him. Well, it is a very difficult choice for Nicodemus or any person in a similar situation. So to better understand this predicament, let us take a look at a few other skeptics in the New Testament. When the Pharisees and the Sadducees decided that Jesus posed a terrible threat, they began to try to discredit him. So let's go there and have a look. These people, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they sent out bright young lawyers and scribes who posed as truth seekers. Now notice, pose as truth seekers to ask Jesus questions. What they were questioning were designed to entrap. Like hostile news reporters today, they will ask questions just to trap you. Like good barristers in a court would do that to you too. And this man tried to catch Jesus saying something that could get him into trouble with the authorities, or at least something that would make Jesus sound stupid. Now, these Jewish leaders were watching Jesus' every move. They had their spies everywhere. They did that in a strong belief that they could expose Jesus as an imposter. So Nicodemus was part of this world of skepticism, don't forget. He was probably more earnest and honest than many of those, but he was also a member of the opposition. You mustn't forget that. And the opposition was ready with questions. Questions not to learn more, but questions to entrap. That is the difference. Now, do you find that you meet people like that these days? People who ask questions simply to prove that they are right or to trap you, but not to seek further truth? There are many out there. See, in the Bible, you can see lots of questions that the Pharisees and the Sadducees tried to trap Jesus. Questions like, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Or another question, if a woman has 7 husbands who all died one after another, whose wife would she be in the resurrection? Unquote. You see, it was all a game, a very serious and deadly game, but a game played by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The questions weren't about getting answers. They were about getting and setting Jesus up, about entrapment, about flooring the opposition, and about proving who was right. You see, they weren't looking for truth that might change their hearts. They were looking for the words that could bounce around in their heads for intellectual arguments and win that argument. One example was a lawyer came up to Jesus one day and asked this question, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Unquote. Now, this question was not about truth-seeking. This question was trying to trap Jesus, because if Jesus said the wrong thing, he will be tried and he can be stoned to death, according to the Jewish society. Yes, the lawyers could occupy themselves, endlessly on that one question. They could carry on very abstract arguments about which principle had priority over which, and as perhaps you might see in some of today's arguments. Jesus, however, summed it up very neatly. He wasn't going to answer a fool according to his folly. He summed it up neatly in a statement from the book of Deuteronomy. And I quote, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, unquote. Everything hangs on these two laws. But you see, the spies were not after clarity. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, scoring points was their goal. Winning a debate was the thing they wanted. But you see, Jesus wasn't about winning debate. He wanted people to face the truth about themselves. Conversely, the spies wanted to hide behind the truth. Do you realize you can do that too? Well, I should say, do you realize we all can do that too? Do you realize you can try to hide behind the truth? You can use it as a shield, hold it out in front of you, wield it as a weapon to win arguments. You can try to score points with it. You can hide behind the truth. That is what the Sadducees and the Pharisees tried to do, and that's what many of us try to do. You can quote the truth so well that nobody notices that you are not dealing with the real problem inside. You can show off the correct state of your mind so no one notices the painful state of your heart. Yes, you can hide behind the truth. We can all hide behind the truth. It is not enough for you to have the right answers. It's not enough for you to be able to quote God's principles. If it is not touching your heart, and if it is not touching your heart with the truth, then it is something else. If you're not allowing God to apply the truth to your own life, it is then not the truth, because the truth changes the person inside. The truth is not about winning arguments. You may argue, you may debate about what you think is right, but that is not the truth. See, this is the dilemma Nicodemus faced. The part of him that was a skeptic wanted to hide behind the truth, but another part of him wanted to take on Jesus' words to the heart. So he's got a conflict inside him. The proud Pharisee Nicodemus wanted to justify himself, but the honest seeker Nicodemus wanted to be taught. See, that night for Nicodemus, there was a real struggle inside him, and unfortunately, pride almost won out. Nicodemus asked questions only to fend off convictions. He spent most of his life intellectualizing everything, and the old habits are hard to change. But you see, Jesus did not need to say much. Jesus reached out into his heart and planted the seed of truth. And let's see what happens after that. Something very important happened to Nicodemus. Nicodemus heard Jesus' words. Although he fought against it that night, but it did enter him, and he couldn't make those words go away. It just stuck to him. They kept trying to get down into his heart despite all the mental games that Nicodemus could ever play. The skeptic was slowly turning into a follower, Nicodemus I meant, or at least he was taking definite steps to that direction. We catch a glimpse of this in a certain meeting of the Sanhedrin. So this was after Nicodemus' interview with Jesus. And in this meeting of the Sanhedrin, they were grilling some officials who were sent out to bring Jesus in for questioning. The officers or the officials had failed to bring arguments against Christ that would be convincing. And the only explanation they could offer was, I quote, "No man ever spoke like this man," unquote. Well, the Sanhedrin rulers were of course very upset, saying in effect, it is only the ignorant crowd that follows this Galilean Jesus. Basically, the Sanhedrin were saying none of us believe in him. Again, In their pride and in their intellectual stupidity, they refuse to see the truth. Now, in the midst of this meeting, in the midst of this intellectual debate, Nicodemus stood up. In John chapter 7, verse 51, Nicodemus said, quote, "Does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he's doing?" Unquote. This was only a question. It may have been only a timid attempt to turn back the tide of pride and prejudices of the Sanhedrin. But Nicodemus had taken a step forward. He had exposed himself to the scorn of his peers. He objected to the peers, the elite of Jerusalem. Guess what happens? The whole group immediately shot back at him. I quote from John chapter 7, verse 52. It says, "Prophets don't just come out of Galilee. Are you from Galilee?" Unquote. Now, it was a way of saying, are you also the same country bumpkin that this guy came from? Don't be so ridiculous, Nicodemus. Don't be so ignorant. Come, think like us. You see the peer group pressure coming in from those proud Pharisees or those members of Sanhedrins? Nicodemus had to do some hard thinking after this. He was essentially being slapped on the hand because it was more evident to his friends in the Sanhedrin who were acting out their jealousy and hatred. Nicodemus saw that, so that they could make their own opposition to Jesus sound very pious, those Sanhedrins, but the murderous tone of their voices was certainly identifying their motives. Now Nicodemus is starting to wake up here. And yet, how could he turn his back on the Sanhedrin? His whole livelihood, his status, his power, his financial prowess come from being a member of the Sanhedrin. It was like turning back on the law of God itself or society, which upheld him, and he would lose everything. He had made it to the top. How could he take the risk of losing everything? It must be horrible for Sanhedrin. Now, this is indeed the result of the truth hitting the heart. The truth starts to set priorities in your heart and question the priorities you've been having. Well, the moment of truth came for Nicodemus at a most unexpected time. It came at a very dark and frightening time, and it came at a scene of a terrific and a terrible crime. This is the result of the piercing words of Jesus into Nicodemus' heart. Now, what happened to Nicodemus when he finally saw the truth? The truth that is demonstrated in Nicodemus' heart was in this scene. I want you to imagine this scene. Jesus, the Galilean, was dying on a Roman cross. The blood was draining from his head and wrist and feet at Golgotha. And the friends of Nicodemus were circling that cross, mocking their defeated enemy. They suggested that if he was really such a miracle worker, he should come down from the cross and save himself. Now, the best and the brightest of the Sanhedrin were staring at what they thought was their final argument. No man blessed of God would be given over such a terrible fate. In short, the brightest of the Sanhedrins had said they had been proven right. They have been right all along about Jesus. He wasn't who he said he was. If he was, he would have come down and saved himself. You see how wrong was the Sanhedrin? When the Roman soldier finally plunged his spear into Jesus, into his side, gushing blood and water, when the body hung pale and limp, they gloated over their victory. Notice this, all the scribes, all the rulers, and the priests could look on and feel themselves proven right. All their spies could look on and see a job well done. All the people who wanted more than anything else to prove themselves right and the other person wrong, they could look on the cross at Jesus and be satisfied by the silence of Jesus' final death. The Sanhedrin thought they were right. They were absolutely proven correct, and their pride has been further inflated because of this. But you see, something else happened on that day. At that moment, Nicodemus could no longer join them, the Sanhedrin. He felt a sense of separation from this pride and this wrongfulness. What Nicodemus saw on that scene on that day, he saw something noble and compassionate about the way Jesus had lived and he had died. Nicodemus saw how Jesus thought of others, saw how Jesus forgave, and Nicodemus finally looked on this Jesus in terms of his own need as a human being. This was a final conviction of Nicodemus' heart. And standing there at the foot of the cross looking up, he realized pride was just too heavy a burden for him to bear. Always trying to defend himself was just too worrisome, a struggle. Always hiding behind the truth was just too self-defeating. It was time to let the truth that Jesus planted into his heart to then finally sink in. It was time to accept that medicine that had been offered to him months ago, one night when Jesus said, "You must be born again." He had realized the truth on that day. So what was the result of this truth sinking into Nicodemus? He then took positive steps. He hurried back into Jerusalem and procured a mixture of myrrh and aloes, the spices used for embalming, and he came back to the cross bearing these gifts. Another colleague from the Sanhedrin, who is Joseph of Arimathea, had received permission from Pilate to bury the body of Jesus. So as other members of the Sanhedrin were watching, mocking, and then now in shock and amazement to see Joseph and Nicodemus gently took Jesus' mangled body down from the cross. Joseph and Nicodemus had to detach the body from the spikes driven into the wood. They had to wipe the blood from Jesus' face as best as they could, and they wrapped Jesus in a burial clothes along with the myrrh and the aloes. Then both Joseph and Nicodemus reverently carried Jesus to Joseph's garden tomb. And as Nicodemus carried the noblest person he had ever known, he was sure that pride was just too heavy a burden to carry. It was far better to bear the yoke of this Christ than to accept the hard truth that pierced that heart. It was far better to stop trying to be right all the time and start out as a needy human being at the foot of the cross. So in conclusion, this is what it meant when we say that why not lay all your baggage down at the foot of the cross? Life is in itself such a struggle. If you cling on to pride, if you cling on to you have to be right all the time, you cling on to the notion that I must be right by proving the other person wrong, that is too hard a life to live. If you're living that life, then lay your baggage down at the foot of the cross. Take up Jesus' advice to Nicodemus, be born again, and in your new birth, you would release all the baggages and the pain and suffering that you've been carrying all these years. So I pray that this message will touch your heart and that this message will set you free, because the truth sets us free. Amen. And God bless you.